Ladies and gentlemen, what a beautiful morning, afternoon, or evening, depending where you are. I'm so thankful you have a moment to spend time with me and one of my favorite people to talk to, Dr. David Salomon. For those who may not be aware, David, would you be so kind as to please reintroduce yourself to those who may be listening for the first time?
Sure, George. Thanks for having me back. Always good to be with you. I am been in higher ed for my pretty much my entire career, and professor of medieval literature, religion, and culture for almost 30 years, and then came to Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia, 6 years ago to open up the Office of Undergraduate Research and Creative Activity, of which I am currently the director.
It's so fitting for so many reasons. Especially on today's topic of creativity, like there is just this spark of the divine. And when we talk about the divine, I think we should mention your book on the 7 deadly sins, which you've recently written, which is its own way, has its own divine nature. For those who are listening, the book is called The 7 Deadly Sins. Check it out. But we're talking about creativity today. And it's almost like there's a spark of the divine. When I say creativity, what do you think of, Dr. Solomon?
That's an interesting question. What do I think of? I mean, I think of the various avenues that you can take to be quote unquote creative, and the ways in which we largely today now have collapsed those and really said, well, really everything is creative.
It makes me wonder, you know, when I think of creativity, sometimes it seems to me that it stems from difficult times. I think there was a great quote that said, I think it was Kurt Vonnegut who said, "We must jump off the cliffs and find a way to fly." I butchered the quote, but it's something along the lines of creativity comes from finding yourself jumping off of places
Yeah.
where you're backed up against the wall. Is that an
Well,
idea of where creativity comes from?
creativity has to, I think, involve a little bit of danger
Yeah,
and risk taking. Right? I mean, the
agreed.
most creative minds in history have been risk takers, whether we're thinking about Leonardo da Vinci or, Picasso or even folks. It hurts me to say this, but folks like Elon Musk, who are somehow being creative, and it involves taking something of a risk, and that can be a pretty scary thing to do, because of course the possibility of the risk is, I mean, using Vonnegut's analogy, you could die, right? I mean, if you jump off the cliff, but you really do have to do that. And I mean, I often encourage students, even in their writing, I say, before you can, I even use that Vonnegut thing. I say, before you can fly, you have to get out on the ledge, right? I mean, you got to be willing to take a risk.
Yeah, and it seems to me like that's another reason why, the person that is creative or a work that is creative seems so attractive to us. It's almost like we can see that risk in there. We can see that
Yeah.
someone had taken that risk and it draws us in.
Yeah, when it's successful, yes, it is kind of a joy to witness. But I would also say that even when it's not successful, there's something to be learned from it and gained from it, either as the creator or as the observer. And I'm thinking about folks who make films that in modern parlance bomb, right, and are just terrible. And I think that we learn something from whatever it is. But I mean, that creativity is about learning, right? I mean, I remember as an undergraduate sitting in a class, and my man who became one of my mentors and most important people in my intellectual life. I remember sitting in class one day, and he was trying something new, some new thing with an author, the way he was approaching it, and it bombed. I can't remember the specifics of what it was, but it bombed. And I remember sitting in the front row of the classroom. So help me, this is 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago, and thinking to myself, well, I'm not going to do that. And just sort of filing away like, well, okay, that doesn't work. But you gotta take those risks, right? I mean, and I think we see it in the world of the arts. We see it in the science world too. As the director of undergraduate research and creative activity, I'm constantly telling students all research involves creativity, and all creativity involves research. It really does. It is both in the same. And if you don't think that scientists have to be creative, you don't understand what science research is.
Yeah, I often wonder because people can get in trouble there. Like when you begin getting into some sort of creative ideas about data, or you create something that
Yeah.
may not be there. It's such a double-edged sword because like on some level you could be looked at as a fraud, and on another level you're looked at as something that's original or avant-garde or something. Like what is that?
Certainly, the whole field of sort of data fudging, if you will, right? Of what now we call fake news, and all of the problems that we've had in the last decade with this kind of issue. Yeah, it's a serious problem, but it's not that creativity that I'm talking about. I'm talking about being creative with. I was just talking with a bunch of students, and we were talking about a student that I had several years ago who was doing a project over the summer in chemistry, and she was working in the lab every day. And about halfway through the summer, the mass spectroscopy machine broke, and we couldn't get it fixed before the end of the summer when she needed to continue working with it. And she needed to become creative about how she was going to continue to do her research. I had a student several years ago during the pandemic who did a summer scholars project in my office virtually over that summer, the first summer of the pandemic. And she was working in biology. And her project was to look at the elasticity of vegan cheese. And she rigged up this crazy Rube Goldberg device in her kitchen using kitchen utensils in order to test the elasticity because she didn't have access to the lab equipment. So, that's what I mean when I'm talking about being creative. And the creativity also comes in when you hit walls, right? And we all deal with that. I mean, I know I deal with that in my own research. Where you're following something that you think is going to lead somewhere, and it leads you down an alley or a hall, and there's nothing there. And now what do you do? I think the resiliency of the researcher or the artist is in what you do. It's making lemonade out of lemons, right? I mean, this fell apart, but now what am I going to do? Right? I'm not going to just crumble and throw it out. What can I do to sort of recreate and refashion this? And that refashioning is something which is really interesting because there's a great book by a guy named Stephen Greenblatt. He wrote a book called Renaissance Self-Fashioning. And he's talking in that book about the fact that the Renaissance, the English Renaissance in particular, was really the first period of time when people really began to create themselves, who they were. You fashioned who you were. And part of that was through actually, what you wore, right? I mean, it was self-fashioning, how you fashioned yourself. And I think a lot of how artists and researchers operate is in looking at how are you going to fashion yourself? What do you see yourself? How do you see yourself as an artist or a researcher? What do you see yourself doing? And how is that then going to bring you to a certain point, a certain end point? But it's, I was looking through some of my things on my shelf this morning when we were talking about creativity. And I opened up a book by Paul Valery called Analects, just a bunch of little things that he wrote over the course of his life, just little notes, really. And one of the ones that I opened up to, he says, "Such is my turn of mind that I don't expect to learn everything from A to Z from books, but only to get seeds of thought that I can cultivate within myself in my private garden." So it's also this idea that you're not going to learn everything from books, but you're going to get the seeds. And it's why it's so important for artists to study other artists, right? I mean, if you want to paint, you have to know what's been done before. You have to study the history of art. And then you take those seeds and you, as he says, you cultivate them within yourself in your own private garden, and you invent something new.
I like that. That's fascinating to me. And my next question was going to be something along the lines of, as a creative director, how do you foster creativity in people? But I think you answered that question by getting people to understand who they are and figure out who they are and then express who they are.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could maybe, yeah.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go on.
I was going to say, with your background and expertise, some of your expertise being in the medieval times, can you draw a parallel to how it seems like those times were restrictive, but there was an explosion of art? And in some ways, it seems like today, like we're being restricted, but I've yet to see the explosion in art. Am I missing it, or are there some parallels there? Or how do you see the two meshing?
I mean, I do think we're having an explosion in art, for lack of another way of putting it, today. There certainly is tremendous growth in the visual arts, in the performing arts, and certainly in writing. And it's a lot of that is the effect of what we've talked about before, being the democratization of society and the internet. I mean, you can now be an artist and put your work up for sale up on, you can make a website, you can put it up on Etsy, you can put it up on eBay, and call yourself an artist. I don't know what that means exactly when you call yourself an artist. I've always struggled a little bit with that. I think to some degree we're all artists. And so I think it's kind of a misnomer to self-identify and say, well, I'm an artist, because we all are. So if I have a student who comes in and says, I'm an artist, and I say, well, what do you do? And they'll say, well, I paint. Okay, so you're a painter, right? Or you're a sculptor, or you are a filmmaker. And to think about the medium that you use to convey your art. The history of looking at creativity is an interesting one, because I mean, it goes back to the Greeks. I mean, Plato and Aristotle are talking about the creative element and what goes into creativity, and the whole, mirror held up to nature and that kind of thing. And then it really isn't until, though, the Enlightenment and the 20th century that we kind of get the idea of a personal creativity. Because for many years, throughout the Middle Ages even, I mean, it was really looked at that only God could create, right? So if we were doing anything, it was just mimicry, it was imitation. And so it wasn't really until we got past the Enlightenment that now it became this, that we were permitted to have the agency to create. And I think that has interesting implications when you look at medieval and Renaissance art, and you see the shift by the time we get to the 18th and 19th century. And I'm not thinking just in visual arts, but in writing, right? I mean, the novel is born at that time. And there's there's a big shift in writing from being about action to being about the internal. For example, I teach a course on Arthurian literature, and most of the early literature in King Arthur is about what the knights did. He went there, he did this, he met her, they did this. And it wasn't until really the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, 12th century, 13th century, with a French writer named Chrétien de Troyes, who writes the first real internal literature about these figures, what they're thinking and what their motivations are. And that's more about what we think about today when we think about writing, right? I mean, if it's C-spot run kind of stuff, we think about that as being childish. We want more of a development of character. And that did not exist originally, because you couldn't create character. Who were you? Only God can create. Well, now we talk about this all the time. Authors creating characters, creating a world, right? The world of Harry Potter, creating these worlds, and that's a tremendous responsibility. I think, as many have noted. The great poet Delmore Schwartz wrote about that a bit, about the importance of understanding the responsibility that we have if we are creating something.
Yeah, that is fascinating to think about. When you look at the shift from action to internal, can you give me some examples of how that shifted our society?
I think in large part it was a greater understanding of who we are as individuals and what makes us tick. And it was, it rivals, of course, the rise of psychoanalysis, Freud, Jung, and this understanding that there's more to a person than just what we're seeing. It's much more involved than that, and we see that reflected, of course, in the literature as well, even before Freud and Jung. I mean, with the development of the novel and the rise of the novel in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Then, I mean, if you look at novels like Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre or the Brontes or any Dickens novel, I mean, they're going deeper inside the characters' minds. And that was a place that we really hadn't gone in literature of that kind before. It was being done to some degree on the stage, right? I mean, the Greeks did it. Shakespeare certainly did it, right? I mean, on stage, we had a better understanding of the character. I mean, if you think about a character like Hamlet, we understand who Hamlet is. It's more than just his action. And we get a lot of that through his soliloquies, where we hear about his inner thoughts. The soliloquy transferred to the page in the novel, then, by the time we get to the development of the novel in the 19th century, and we are getting that in those kinds of characters.
So in a way, we could kind of see our own evolution of creation through the arts in that form.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And I'm sure that this is paralleled to some degree in the music world.
Right.
Not being enough of an aficionado of classical music, I can't say much about that. I know Mozart, and that's about it. But I mean, if we think about contemporary music today, and even popular music, and the way that it is so confessional and so revelatory. I mean, everybody, Taylor Swift just tells you all about every relationship that she's had. She's an open book. That's something which is a modern sort of phenomenon in some ways. I mean, you might trace it back to James Joyce. Look at Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and then eventually Ulysses, and really hearing what's inside the characters' minds. I mean, when I read Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, that book is incredibly painful, because you are really inside Stephen Daedalus's head, experiencing what he's experiencing as a teenage boy at this Catholic school. And he is in a lot of pain. And because we are hearing it from his perspective, we are able to kind of tap into that empathy.
Yeah, that's a. Can you excuse me for 1 second? I gotta go. My cat is just killing me real fast. Yeah. Sorry about that. Hey, you monkeys! What are you doing? Get down from there. Get down. There we go. I'm sorry about that. Those crazy animals are driving me nuts. Yeah, so it blows my mind to think about when you look at through the lens of music today. I think there's a parallel. Well, some people who are artists, I guess they, like you said, they can all be artists, but there are some people that write their own music, they play their own instruments, whether they sing or they play an instrument. And then there's other particular bands or individuals who have stuff written for them and they follow a script. And on some level, I think most people, while still looking at them as a performer, see them differently than someone who is creating their own type of music, their own type of sound. And I think you can draw a parallel between an artist that writes a book or performs that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's the development of singer-songwriter in the 1960s, right? But that doesn't mean that somebody like Frank Sinatra or Mel Torme or Whitney Houston, who are interpreting other people's songs, aren't artists in their own right, because they are interpreting them. They are, I mean, we always think about that as being, the best performances like that make it theirs. I mean, I don't know who wrote most of the songs that Sinatra sang. I think about them as Sinatra songs because his interpretations of them are just so powerful and so his. It's a song. I mean, if I say White Christmas, you think Bing Crosby, and Bing Crosby didn't write White Christmas. But he made that song his. And now, if anybody else sings White Christmas, I don't know about you, but automatically in my mind, I'm comparing it to Bing Crosby and say, this isn't better than Bing Crosby. I'd rather hear Bing Crosby.
And so sometimes we see this intersection or this eruption of creative forces. And when we talk about who wrote a Sinatra song or Bing Crosby, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and there was a band called Milli Vanilli. And these guys just looked like they were the perfect people to sing this song. But it turns out they have this huge concert, the record skips, and this whole thing explodes, and they were just front people. But it's not like they weren't creative. They were good dancers. They were doing stuff.
Yeah, but they weren't only front people, George. They were lip syncing.
I know.
They weren't even singing.
They were lip syncing.
So it's one thing to be singing and interpreting somebody else's stuff, but all they were doing was dancing and lip syncing. So that was the problem there. It wasn't them singing. And of course, sadly, one of those guys eventually committed suicide.
Yeah, it's a horrible thing. But I was trying to bring up the point of creativity. It almost got hijacked by, like, there was somebody in the background that said, you know what, I like this sound, but it would be a lot better if these guys pretended to sing it. And that's its own sort of way of captivating or stealing creativity, and that eruption between the people that actually created it and the people that were trying to create an image of it. Like, there's this weird dichotomy there.
Yeah. I mean, I always think it's interesting when you hear a songwriter play and sing his or her own songs, even if they're not the ones who made the songs famous, because it takes on a whole different tenor. And I find that very interesting. I actually enjoy listening to those kinds of recordings. Usually they're acoustic, of them playing, on a piano or with a guitar and singing the song that they wrote, even if it's not the one that they made famous because it was made famous by somebody else.
Yeah, I remember one of my mentors told me when I was spending a lot of time with him, he says, George, who writes all Elton John songs? And I'm like, I have no idea. And he began to tell me, look, there's the way the world operates. Sometimes you can be the guy in the flashy jacket. Sometimes you can be the guy behind the scenes. Very rarely are you both. But I always held on to that. And I'm like, wow, and it just got me thinking, like, what kind of an individual, like, the person that writes and creates the song usually has the passion, but maybe they don't have the need to want to wear the flashy jacket, but they're happy to create it for someone else. That's an interesting. I always think that's very fascinating.
Yeah, maybe, and I mean, of course, in the case of Elton John, Elton John does write the music. Bernie Taupin writes the lyrics.
Okay.
For most of those songs. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I've never heard Bernie Taupin sing. I don't know if he can sing, but certainly Elton John is an entertainer. And that's the way I would think of him, as an entertainer, right? Whereas, somebody like James Taylor is a singer-songwriter. Although a lot of James Taylor's most famous songs he didn't write, which I would find interesting. Songs that you identify with James Taylor, and you're like, oh, well, he actually didn't write that. I mean, You've Got a Friend, he didn't write.
That's funny. That the title of that song, "You Got a Friend," and then he didn't write that song. He just had a good friend write him that song.
Yeah. Well, I think Carole King wrote that song. I think somebody can correct us if I'm wrong, but and how many kids sing that at camp? I mean, it's a camp song, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's mind blowing to me. And in some ways, I think we're on the cusp of seeing this radical shift, the same way you spoke about the Arthurian legends of action giving way to internal thought. I think we're on the cusp of a new way of looking at things, or maybe a cyclical way of looking at things. If you had to take a guess at what may be the next shift, what would you guess?
Well, I'm worried that people are going too far within themselves and becoming isolated. That's a real concern. I mean, when I think about the ways in which, and let's just do the last 100 years, when the ways in which certain artists have dealt with their creative drive and the kind of pain that goes with a lot of that. I mean, there have been multiple studies of the links between creativity and mental illness, right? Creativity
Yes.
and bipolar, creativity and depression and schizophrenia. And some of the greatest artists of the last half of the 20th century certainly dealt with one of those very problems. I'm worried today that people have become so isolated that ultimately the next the next Allen Ginsberg may be out there, but may be so isolated and so in his own head that we're not getting the fruits of that. I don't know. I don't read a lot of the sort of scattered stuff that's on the internet. I mean, everybody's got a web page, right? I don't read a lot of that. And so, I know I've got friends who are big followers of X, Y, or Z who publishes just online. And I tend not to look at that stuff. And I guess it's just my own old fashioned bias in saying, well, it should be published and available in that way, in some kind of a vetted way, rather than this, everybody can have anything up on the internet. So I don't know. The isolation, I think, is what I'm concerned about. Is people being isolated and keeping a lot. I mean, I see some incredible art produced by my students, and I'll talk with some of them, and that they're majoring in finance. And it's like, oh, that's great, but you're not sharing your art. You're not sharing your art with the world, and you should. Be a finance major, but share your art. I mean, I have a student from several years ago who is a lawyer now, pretty successful, pretty good lawyer, and she's also an amazing painter. And she has continued to paint and show her work. Now, granted, we're talking about people who have privileged positions that they could do that. But I do think that that's an important part of it. I mean, it's an important part of what we talk about with research and creative work, right? Research and creative activity are nothing if they aren't disseminated. If you don't share it with others, it's pointless. You're not Emily Dickinson, right? You're not going to lock up your poems in a box with a bow on it, and then someone's going to discover it after you die. It doesn't mean anything if you're not sharing it with other people, because that is what contributes and gets a discussion going and contributes to the overall discussion. And I think that that's what's really important in this work. So, we talk about this all the time when we talk about students working on projects. And, I'll say, well, you're going to submit that to present at a conference, right? No, I'm not going to do that. It's like, well, then why did you just do that work? Because nobody's going to know about it.
That brings up some really interesting points. When you speak about the idea of isolation, it automatically brought to my mind this kind of voyeuristic world in which we're beginning to live. And I'll give you an example of that. There's a whole new genre of books called like lit RPG, like role-playing games. So people are writing books about someone else playing a game, and you as the reader plug it. When I was a young man, I don't play video games now as a man, but when I was a little boy, I played them all the time. And nowadays, it's not uncommon to have groups of young boys or girls watch other people play video games. The same way you would go and watch a sport, a soccer, football game. They'll sit down and watch somebody else play a video game. It's
Yeah.
voyeuristic in that way, and I wonder if the isolation has something to do with that.
Yeah, it might. I don't understand that. I've happened upon those kinds of things because even ESPN sometimes shows them, and I'm like, well, wait, we're watching someone play a video game. I don't get that. I mean, I remember standing around somebody in an arcade watching them play, and
Yeah, waiting for your
I hope
turn.
you're gonna finally rescue the princess or beat Pac-Man, but I don't really get that. I think that the rise in these RPGs is really interesting because again, we're talking about creating, right? Creating characters, creating worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And it's akin to, what some of us remember playing Dungeons and Dragons back in the 70s, which I guess is hot again. And that's what that is, right? You're creating these characters and you're creating this alternate universe. And all of these are, I think, are kind of group activities. Now, whether they're conducted actually in person or over the internet, because you're playing a game with someone who's 5,000 miles away, the isolation there, that bugs me a bit. The idea of somebody sitting in their room, 24/7, playing a game with a bunch of other people online from around the world and thinking that they're having a social experience, I think that's a problem. And the studies are coming out about this because it's a live thing. It's happening now. The effect of this on people. We saw it through COVID, right? I mean, all of these students who sat
Mm-hmm.
on their beds for months on end, supposedly doing school and missing out on any social interactions. And what did that mean now that they're back in school? It's really it's changed a lot.
Yeah, on a, I try to find reasons or look for the positive things that I think may be happening. And sometimes I think if I can think of these things, they must be real on some level. And I want to give you an example of an interesting thing and then get your opinion on it. A lot of the children today, they will have their headsets on and they will be playing games online. And when you look at someone from if you're watching someone play a game and they have their headset on, it's very similar to hearing voices in your head, which we would have thought of as someone with a mental disorder
Yeah.
not too long ago. And one of the positive outcomes of that I was recently speaking to a gentleman, and we were talking about goals and how to make your life better and make the world around you better. And one of the things he said is like, I really get a kick out of doing things for people and having them not know who I am. Maybe I can come up and say something kind to them, or I can point them in the right direction, or I can give them a book. And, I don't need any recognition for that. I just want to help. And in my mind, I think it does. And then I correlate, maybe those two things are correlated between speaking to a voice on a headset that you may never see their face and doing something kind for them, whether it's in the game, but then equating that to real world outside. Like now you're out in the world, and the same way you did something nice for the voice in your head, maybe you see that other person as a voice out there. And maybe that's something that's kind of shifting the conscious of people. Is that too far out there?
No, I mean, and I think if that does transfer, then that would be a wonderful thing. I'm not sure it is, but I think I'm not sure it is because I think what's happened is a lot of the time, especially the kids who are playing those games, are at such a formative stage in their maturation that it's removing something from their social skills. And so I don't know if it's transferring. I think it just is encouraging them actually to just be alone and inside their head. And I could be completely wrong. And, please argue with me if you think I am. But I think that, it would be nice if that transferred. I don't know if it is. I think that, and I'm not going to pile on video games here by talking about them as being this horrible, evil thing. But we all know that most video games, by and large, are based in some kind of violence. Certainly the popular ones, if you look at the top 10 best-selling ones. And I'm afraid of what that's teaching kids about how to deal with conflict. Um, and we were kids. We watched Bugs Bunny, and they were, Bugs Bunny could be pretty violent, but we always knew it was a cartoon. And because video games are getting to be so real and realistic, um, and because the kids who are playing them are such formative ages in their emotional and psychological development, I worry sometimes that they're just transferring that and saying, well, okay, the video game, that was so real, and now look at reality. It's just like that. And it's not. And we see it. I mean, the rise of violence. I mean, the occurrence of violence in our culture. It's just it's sickening. I mean, I watch the local news here every morning, and it's like watching a police blotter, because all it is talking about is the shootings that happened last night. And of course, we're seeing it oftentimes happen younger and younger. We just had this very high profile case here in Newport News last week where a 6-year-old shot his teacher. It's just it's crazy. It's crazy. And so that elementary school has been closed. I think they're planning to reopen Monday, so they will have been closed for almost 2 full weeks. They had a big meeting last night with parents, and one of the solutions is they're putting in metal detectors. So again, it's not really looking at what's the root of the problem here, because in the typical Western fashion, we don't look at prevention, we look at treating the symptoms.
Yeah, everything from social disasters to drug design. We're not trying to solve the problem. We're just trying to put a big Band-Aid on there.
Yeah.
And when you speak about the idea of video games in that manner, it's weird to see the world in which technology is trying to gamify the workplace, gamify driving, gamify everything. And the majority of games out there are goal oriented, and it usually has to do with some sort of materialistic gain. It's not like you're trying to create a better environment, or you're trying to become more part of the system or develop. I wonder what part of what is language? Where does language fit into creativity? We spoke about the medieval ages, and obviously there was a different type of communication there, and there was a different type of writing and a different type of art. Move forward into almost, I would argue that there's been a degradation of language, and maybe that shows maybe that arises at the same time as the artists who what was that form of art when the deconstructionists, did they come out in a time when language is being degraded, or can you draw a parallel to language and creativity?
I don't know if it's a degradation. I mean, the English language is a living language, and so it's constantly changing. And there are, certainly two different sort of schools of thought when it comes to this. The one is the prescriptivists, who say, this is the way it should be, and these are the rules. And the other are the descriptivists, who are, well, this is the way language is being used, so that's what we're looking at. And I think, both of them are interesting. Both of them have merits, I think. I have never been one to teach grammar in a class. Even when I taught, remedial English classes years ago, I never really taught grammar, because my attitude about it always was that it's like driving a car. I mean, in order to drive a car, you don't first have to learn how the engine works. And so, if you know the rules of grammar, that's not really going to help you to become necessarily a better writer. I think you write and you kind of learn as you need to go along. It makes me think about the program Microsoft Excel, the spreadsheet program, right? That program can do everything from, doing the most basic things that you might need, of putting together a list of invitations for your birthday party, to doing, high financial analysis for a corporation. Well, I needed to do something in between. And so, I'm not going to I don't need to know how to do the high finance for the corporation. So I'm going to sort of just dive in there and start fooling with it. And then as things come up, I'm like, okay, well, how do you do this? Because that's really what I need to know. And one of the problems that I've always had with the especially the books that come out to help you learn how to use a computer program is it starts from the most basic thing, and it's going to show you everything. It's like, I don't need to know everything. I only need to know how to do this. This is what my part of it is. And so I've always thought that the teaching of formal English grammar is probably not very helpful. Now, I should say, in elementary school, some of it is. But once you get past there and you're on to middle school and high school, if you haven't learned that yet, you ain't learning it now. And so it really is not going to be helpful. And so I find the usagists, the folks who study English usage, really interesting. There's a guy named Garner who publishes a book on English usage. I forget how many editions he's had now. American English Usage, and it's a dictionary of American English usage, of words and how they're being used. And I was just at an event, and one of my students was sitting there, and she had socks on that had a Labrador Retriever on it. And the student who was sitting next to her said they were making a joke about, having your socks off and your dog's free. And she looked at me and said, "Do you know what that means?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm old. I'm not dead. Your dog's in that case, and your feet." She was talking about her feet with the socks on. But if you were to look up dogs in the Oxford English Dictionary, you're not going to find that they may mean feet. But usage, yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. It reminds me of that old book, Flatland by Abbott, and how people can see things in like a one-dimensional way or a two-dimensional way. And if you lived in this one plane and you saw a cube coming in, you'd have no words to describe it. You would just see this. You wouldn't see all the dimensions of it. Well, I worry sometimes.
Well, it's perspective, right? I mean, now we're back with perspective and how we view the world. I think about that very early film by the Lumiere brothers of the train coming towards the station, and people sitting in the theater when they saw that screaming because they thought the train was going to come right off the screen and come into the station. It's perspective, and it's what you are familiar with and what you understand. And so it's frames of reference, right?
And maybe, so this is an idea that I had a while back, that what if we used our language today? Like let's take the English language and we added like some sort of suffix and a prefix that denoted honesty, almost like honorifics or something like that. Like, maybe we're one step away. Maybe, and we can see the language changing right now, the different ways in which we're using different parts of language we never have before. What if we're on the cusp of just changing a suffix that denoted honesty and integrity? And if you use that in contract law, all of a sudden people would be held guilty. They would be held accountable. Maybe that's where we're at with this idea of creativity and this rebirth. Sort of where we're at right now is our language is about to shift in a way that allows us to understand a new perspective, because that's really all we need, is just a shift in perspective to get the world back where we want it to be, or to set up the world in a direction that we want to go. Maybe that's where we're headed.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps. I mean, the roadblocks there are everybody's got on board, and and as we've talked about so often, our world is just moving so damn fast that to have everybody sort of stop and say, hey, look over here. I don't even know if that's possible anymore. Because I mean, the flood of media and data on a daily basis that people get, it's kind of frightening to think of, and I mean, and mind you, I don't want to go back to the days when, although sometimes, nostalgically maybe, when you got your morning paper and you watched the news at 6 o'clock and you listened to Walter Cronkite and you got the late news at 11 o'clock and that was all you knew.
Yeah.
Now we are inundated with news, every moment of every day, and it's overwhelming at times. I understand why people want to sort of retreat, and I do understand why people are becoming isolated
Yeah.
for that reason, because it's scary. It's hard to keep up with. It's scary from that perspective. If you are somebody who prides yourself on knowing what's going on, being that person today is a hell of a lot more work and has more pressure than it did 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, learning something today that may be true that causes you to have to go back and revisit everything that you did in the past. That's a big problem. That's a lot of bandwidth. That's a lot of perspective changing in real time that you have to do if you want to, you know, be intellectually honest with yourself, or maybe that's dishonest. I don't know, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of things you have to go back and rethink. It's like in that book 1984 when they would get the new thing would come out depending on who they're at war with, and you got to go back and change all the articles and change everything in your mind. I can understand it too. It does seem as if the times we were just at not too long ago were so much simpler.
Well, but we experience those shifts
Yeah.
in a lot of arenas. I was reading the New York Times review this morning of the new Night Court comedy that's on. I think it's on NBC, and it's a kind of a reboot of the old Night Court show. John Larroquette is on it again, and there was an interview with him in the Times, and he's 75 now. He had no interest in doing it. He was convinced to do it. He's reprising the role, but he talked about the fact that, I mean, it's a very different character now, because when it was on in the 1980s, 80s and I guess early 90s, I think it was, he was a sort of despicable womanizer, and that's not going to fly today. And so, I didn't watch the show. It was on, I guess, last night, I think, or the night before. I still want to see it because I did like the original. But it's interesting the way that those shifts are happening, even within people's lifetimes, when that wasn't the case previously, right? I mean, those kinds of changes would take decades. And now the shift occurs, almost overnight. I mean, I can remember presenting at a conference in Washington, D.C., probably this is maybe 10 years ago. And we were talking about compensating faculty and faculty evaluation. Very exciting topic. The movie will be out next week. George Clooney will be playing me. And I remember somebody asked a question. We were in a packed room for this presentation because it was a very hot topic that we were presenting about. And somebody asked a question, and I said, well, we need to make sure that this is, equitable for all faculty, or they're going to feel like they're getting gypped. And someone came up to me after the talk and said, do you know that that's a slander to say gypped? And I at that time did not know, did not understand why it was, I mean, I really remember I went back to my hotel room and I looked it up because I was like, well, wait a minute, what? And I realized that, yes, I mean, it's short for gypsies and, the idea of being gypped. And it actually was a kind of a slander, and that you can't use that word anymore. And so there's a shift that occurred, pretty quickly within my lifetime, to be sure. And so the way that language changes and the way that we're sort of permitted to use language and what's permissible. I mean, today we're seeing it in probably in a more heightened degree than ever before, because, all you have to do is tweet something that's got the wrong word or the wrong attitude or the wrong sentiment. And, we live in cancel culture.
Yeah, it's true. I recently saw a debate with Jordan Peterson and Eric Dyson. It was fascinating to see two of these guys get up there. Both of them have such a command of the English language, and it just it brought me hope in some ways to think like, wow, there are people out here that are pushing the boundaries of what is possible, and they can communicate it not only to themselves but to each other, and
Yeah.
and the idea that you can push those boundaries using language. And it just made me realize how important the language we have is, especially teaching it to the kids, and the use of metaphors and the ability to have a language that is almost beheld in front of you, when you see someone that understands the trivium and rhetoric and can put these things in front of you, and you can see the world in a way. It gives me hope and promise to see, just to use language like that. I can see what's going to happen. It's fascinating to think
I
of it
mean,
that way.
language still is power. It always has been,
Yes.
right? And if you are articulate, you are looked at with a different view than someone who is not. I oftentimes teach the essays of James Baldwin. Fantastic, incredible essayist. I mean, just unbelievable with language. And he basically says that if you're going to talk to white people about the problem of Black America, you're going to have to talk to them in their language. And so he realized that he was going to have to do that. Toni Morrison has said the same thing. And so, there's something to that. I remember during the first Gulf War, we had sent CIA folks over to the Middle East, and there was a story on 60 Minutes about the fact that I think we had 2 CIA agents who were fluent in Farsi, and they were talking to all these people whose language was Farsi, but we couldn't speak their language. So how are you going to deal with anybody? I mean, in that case, trying to talk with them about what was happening in their world in an attempt to try to change things, but you don't speak their language. And so, there's a Baldwin essay called Stranger in the Village, one of my favorite essays, where he talks about, when he went to Switzerland, and he says, I'm sure that before I got to this little small Swiss village, they had never seen a Black man before. And he talks about the whole history of Western culture and of it being white, and how in order to sort of make a change, it meant that he was going to have to speak their language.
Man, it's interesting, the relationship between culture and language, and how they are, almost beyond. There's no way to describe. There's no words to really describe it. I mean, you can say it's rich or it's complicated, but it's very difficult to present an argument that has the essence of the relationship between those two things. No wonder we can't get along. No wonder there's so much war. It's we can't communicate effectively.
Well, I mean, that's the paradox of the Tower of Babel, right? I mean,
I was gonna say
it's the
that.
Bible, right? Up until then, everyone spoke the same language, and God and it being vindictive in that story, because the people were trying to build the tower to reach him, supposedly whips all these foreign languages on them, so they can't work together, so they can't talk and communicate, so they can't continue to build the tower. But getting away from that, I mean, the beauty of languages is it's really kind of incredible when you look at them. I mean, the study of foreign languages in American schools is in such a bad state, and it's really disturbing. I mean, this attitude that well, everyone speaks English is just it's moronic, to be honest. And I mean, I think the ability to be articulate in any language, whether it's English, French, Farsi, or Russian, whatever it is a gift. I mean, I know, I mean, I can read French. My spoken French is terrible, but I can read French. And when I read, something, a Balzac novel or Proust, I mean, I can appreciate the use of the French language the same way that I do when I read an English novelist, and appreciate the way that they are articulating themselves, or nonfiction for that matter. Whatever it is that I'm reading in the daily paper or magazines, and seeing the way people have really honed their craft, because it is a craft. It is a craft. Using language is a craft. Writing is a craft. And the only way you can do it is to practice.
Yeah, maybe that's one reason why sometimes, at least in my world, maybe that's why, with the explosion and the adoption of English everywhere, maybe that's why we begin to see things kind of bland or one-dimensional, is that we're only using one way to describe things. And I think in ancient Greek and in Hebrew, the letters serve as numbers. And when you learn a different language, you learn the different structure of that language. Like sometimes there's no double negative, or the verb comes before the noun, or vice versa. And when you begin studying languages, you begin seeing the world different. So when we start losing languages, you can argue that we're losing ways in which to interpret the world.
Well, and in some ways, I think what we have done as a culture is we've removed the nuance from the English language.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of foreign languages are still incredibly nuanced. I mean, you talk about Hebrew. I mean, biblical Hebrew doesn't have any vowels. And so when you read biblical Hebrew, there's a lot of nuance into reading that, because you have to understand what those words are without seeing the vowels. And I think we've removed a lot of the nuance from language today and made it too much about, this is what it means. It's a one for one. There's no nuance. And that's a dangerous thing.
Yeah. I think that comes from law and finance. Like that's
Absolutely.
People trying to figure out, this is it, black or white.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it legalizes everything that we say, right? I mean, because now any word that comes out of my mouth has a they would say a standard sort of static meaning. That's what it means. Yeah. And it's not enough to say, well, I didn't mean it that way, because but that's what you said, right? That's dangerous.
It is dangerous. It allows us to focus on the least common denominator, regardless of who we are. And let's just simplify this incredible piece of work down to like something so it makes me kind of mad. You have to laugh if you don't get upset, but let's just break this beautiful thing down into like something really ugly and small. How about that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, as we're getting ready to land the plane right here, I got a little exercise that I wanted to do with you. And I'm going to go through some pages here, and I would like you to give me your initial idea of what you think of when you see these images. Are you ready?
Okay. Feel like I'm getting into the psychoanalysis.
What do you think of when you see
the analyst chair here?
You are.
What do I think of when I see that? That looks like, well, I mean, a free associate. I mean, that to me, that reminds me of Hildegard of Bingen's Illuminations, 12th century, where God's light comes down to her in her illuminations to her mind. Here, that light is coming into this person's heart, and they are really awestruck by it.
Beautiful. Let's move on.
This is Jung's Red Book, isn't it? Is it?
I thought I would have got a couple more pages before you figured that out. It is. Yeah.
I thought it looked familiar. Well, I mean, the snake, I think, I mean, especially when it comes to Jung, I think the Ouroboros, right? Although that's an interesting sort of, almost looks like a paw print in the red.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, let's keep moving here. We'll go through a couple more just to get your take here. This one's an interesting one.
Oh, yes. This reminds me of what's that ancient statue of the woman? it's one of the oldest statues that we have. I can't remember the name of it. It reminds me of that. In the statue, the woman has very wide hips. It's a very female image. Of course, not even looking at what Jung's doing in the backgrounds in these, which is all interesting as well.
Right.
Can't tell what she's holding though. Interesting. What do you think that is?
I see I just see the primitive nature of it when I see it without digging into what exactly she's holding. It just seems to me that I would go with the primordial now, like this is us now, even though that was us then. Like we're still here in this moment, as modern as we think we are, was trying to grasp on to that which we've. It doesn't really make sense, but
it's.
I think you get the point. Like it's.
Yeah, it's the Venus of Willendorf that I'm thinking of. I don't know if you can get that. If you can get that image up.
I can picture it in my mind, but
yeah,
I've seen it. It's like a bronze statue, almost like a bronze color.
It's here. I'm going to try to move my camera to show you. Hang on a second.
Okay. Oh yes. Yep. Yeah, it's fascinating to think of. I had heard some interesting stories about Jung and the Red Book and his time writing it, and it's just such a mystical adventure. Like,
oh yeah,
I can't say enough about it.
Yeah, here this looks like possibly something like the self stuck in a room. But it shows that there's depth, right? There's depth often the perspective goes, so that you can go through there and maybe dive deeper in. It's a hell of a hat, though, isn't it?
It is. This one I think speaks to creativity, like we were talking about. Like there's so much depth, and there's the illusion of life, and the illusion of us being trapped, going towards the light, and focusing on. I think that's what that dot represents, is like the intense focus of. And then to pan back out and realize that you're just in this brick room of consciousness.
Yeah, but the perspective there is really kind of interesting, though, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It really is.
Huh.
Especially when you look at the different walls like that. Like it's almost like a spiral. If you pan back a little bit, it's kind of sucking you in there. Like it's almost like a bottomless pit on some levels. Are you looking up or are you looking down when you see that hole there? I guess it depends how you feel that day.
Yeah.
Let's do one more here.
Okay.
This is a pretty awesome one too, but let me see if I can get a bigger picture here. This one's pretty fascinating too. This one's back to the Ouroboros as well, it seems like.
Yeah.
This guy's got his sword in there as if he can claim his fate, but he's destined to repeat it on some level.
He's trying to escape it.
Yeah, I like that. It's so fascinating to me, right?
Yeah. Yeah, Jung's Red Book
is
and
it gets me. I wish I could read it in its form.
Yeah. Well, you have the English translation? There is an English translation.
I have the. Yeah. I think I don't have the actual translation, but in this actual book, this giant manuscript of a book, they give you some sort of breakdown of it. But
there's a separate volume that was just translation of all the text.
Yeah,
and it's much cheaper than the book.
This one was pretty pricey, but it's a nice one to have for a conversational piece. And if you have some free time, just to sit down and try to wrap your mind around what the human mind is capable of if you're happen to be born that way, I guess. But
Yeah.
it's fascinating, and it's like the only manuscript that I really have. It's interesting to think about how information may have been consumed. Well, you, as someone who has studied those particular ages, what was it like, do you think, for the people that were reading manuscripts?
Yeah, I mean, working with manuscripts to me is one of the greatest things that I'm able to do. And working with medieval manuscripts when I have done is just incredible, because the history there is just amazing. And to think about, the scribe writing it, or if it is something by the actual author writing it. It's one of the reasons why whenever I go to libraries, I love to see those exhibits where they're showing manuscripts. And it's one of the things that we lament, is that a lot of that seems to be gone now because everything is done on the computer. And so the handwritten manuscripts have kind of gone the way of the dodo bird. And that's too bad, because I know when I've studied William Wordsworth's poems, we have the manuscript of the Prelude, his autobiographical epic, and it's such an incredible poem, and I love the poem to read the whole book, and then to look at the manuscript and actually look at his handwriting, writing this all out, just to me is there's something magical about that.
Was there some sort of alphabet in like a picturesque alphabet? It seems that there was some sort of codified language in manuscripts via images that we don't have now.
Well, there is. I mean, so for the images, I mean, there is the whole field of iconography, right? But in paleography, which is the study of manuscripts, a lot of the medieval manuscripts are written in a kind of shorthand, and some of the trick of working with them is that decoding. And it can be really interesting. It can be incredibly frustrating. There is an Italian guy named Capelli who put together a dictionary. Must have been back in the 1940s or 50s. I have it over on my shelf here. And he went through medieval manuscripts and basically compiled a dictionary that attempts to kind of give you the decoding of the shorthand in these manuscripts. It doesn't work for all of them, because a lot of the scribes use different things. Right. But, if you look at some of these authors, I mean, I mentioned Hildegard of Bingen before. I mean, Hildegard had several of her pieces are written in a language that we don't know what it is. It was a language that was apparently invented for the nuns at the abbey where she was, that she invented, and we've never found the cipher, so we don't know what the heck it says. But apparently the nuns understood it.
So, okay, now that you say that, like, is this just part of the journey, David? Do we create libraries? Do we create languages, and then we must forget them so that we can? Maybe we have to forget them so that we can move forward. Maybe we're trapped by the past if we don't continue to move forward the language.
I think that maybe. I mean, it depends on whether or not you're going to look at the language as being a living language, and whether you're willing to let it be malleable and adaptive. I mean, if you're going to be restrictive, I mean, famously, the French have their own academy that governs language, that governs the French language to keep the purity of the language. English has nothing like that. And I think one of the only ways that it progresses is if it does have that adaptability. You look at something like, I mean, any of the dead languages. I mean, I deal a lot with the Celtic languages, and many of those are dead languages. Now, a dead language means that no one speaks it anymore. So that's the definition. A language is dead if there aren't any speakers of it still alive and using the language. So, for example, Latin is considered a dead language. It is still the language of, obviously, the Catholic Church, and the only place that actually still uses it on a daily basis is the Vatican. but it is not a living language. The language is, that's it. Now, sometimes that's really helpful. I mean, I can remember when I studied New Testament Greek in graduate school. I mean, New Testament Greek, which is different from classical Greek and different from modern Greek. New Testament Greek is the words in Greek in the Greek New Testament. Once you learn that, you know New Testament Greek. That's the language. That's all there is. So it never changed, right? I mean, it was what it was. Aramaic, a lot of these ancient languages are the same way. But it really is interesting because without our ability to understand them, we can't understand our past. I mean, look at the history of the Rosetta Stone. Without deciphering that, we wouldn't know our past. We wouldn't understand what came before. And language is, as we said before, language is power.
Yeah. Have you read the Bible in Hebrew, English, and New Testament Greek?
I have read most of the Old Testament in biblical Hebrew. I've read the New Testament in New Testament Greek, and yes, gone through it in English, and read big chunks of it in Latin, medieval Latin, church Latin. Yeah.
That's fascinating to me. Like, you're the only person I know who's done that. Like, that's
Well,
so true that I know you. What?
I'm not sure it's a badge I want to wear, but yeah. I mean, as somebody who studies the past, I mean, you have to be conversant in language. You have to be able to deal with that. Otherwise, you can't study it. You can't look at it. I mean, it's like someone who wants to study, the novels of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but can't speak Spanish. I mean, you can read them in English translation, but you're not getting the original. You're not getting the real thing. It's like reading Proust in French, which I don't recommend to anybody. Proust in English is difficult enough. But it's akin to that. I mean, if you really want to read Proust, I mean, I remember in graduate school when I said to my professor, I said, I really think I should read Proust. I'd never read him in English or French. And I remember he said to me, he said, why? And I said, well, isn't it something to have done? And he said, well, I've never read him. And I said, oh, and so I read, some of Proust. I have not gotten through even half of it. But I've also read large chunks of it in French to see what the actual original looks like. And boy, it's as difficult as the English translation. The man loved a long sentence.
It's fascinating. Well, as we're coming close to the end here, what do you got coming up? Where can people find you, and what are you excited about?
Yeah, so my website's David A. Salomon, SALOMON.com. Links to my blog and my books and speaking engagements and my consulting and exciting things that are coming up. We are in the second week of our new semester, which feels like it should be spring break already, but we won't go there. And I've got a great class of students that I'm teaching in an advanced museum studies course. We're just getting ready to start doing some curating work for an exhibition that we're going to be putting on in April, and just real glad to be able to talk to you.
Yeah, pleasure's all mine. I really enjoy the conversations, and I enjoy learning, and I've gotten some great feedback from some people that are also getting to tune in when they can and play a part. So thank you for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for participating in the chat and taking time to spend with us, and hopefully getting to learn as we go through our own journey and try to solve the world's problems. That's all we got for today, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have a fantastic day. Aloha.